Need my glasses for this because my topic is about emails. So I'm John Smylie. Where do I come from? What do I do? Well, I would describe myself as a humble architect. And thank you, Bob, for the introduction. But I think for the very kind introduction that makes me feel sort of important. But I'm a humble architect. I can see some of you laughing there that I'm using the words humble and architect in the same sentence. Yes. Our studio, it's in Belfast, the city where Professor James Curl was born. And Belfast is not far from the little village of Hollywood in County Down, where James sadly passed away at home last year. And I really haven't known James for that long. I mean, I first met him in September 2018. I'll go to the first slide here because I've got a photograph of him and me. At the launch in Belfast of his, many would say, controversial book, Making Dystopia, we made friends very quickly because, well, certainly as far as architecture was concerned, we had everything in common. James, I could tell from meeting him at that stage, needed allies at this time. I understood that immediately. Any author who gives birth to his magnum opus needs support, I guess, as the reviews start to come in. James knew that it was going to be additionally difficult for him because the modernist architectural establishment was, and still is, known for brooking no dissent. For example, we all remember how the mods reacted, I think it was 1977, to David Watkins's Morality in Architecture, his book, and then in 1981 to Tom Wolfe's From Our House to Bauhaus, and then again in 1989 to the then Prince of Wales's A Vision of Britain. Also, if you remember, around about the same time as James's book was published in 2018, Sir Roger Scruton had been appointed chair of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission by the then Tory government. And if you recall, this was met with howls of derision from the modernist profession. So, yeah, around about that time, 2018, September 2018, things in the architecture world were already, to say the least, a little tense. Yep. So, I met James, and I very quickly ended up getting invited onto an email group. He set it up, of course, and the purpose of which, certainly initially, was to analyze the book reviews that, good and bad, that were coming in, and to discuss their content, I guess, yeah. I do recall that the opinions of those in the email group were quite often sought on, it could be a daily basis, actually. He was quite energetic, James, as we heard earlier. And at his discretion, the makeup of the group could change, yeah. Often present in this, you might call it a chat room, was Nir Burras, Anthony Daniels, we've got them here today, thankfully, Michael Mahaffey, we all know Michael, and the Luxembourg classical architect, Colin Mulhern, and Leon Creer, he would make appearances also. So, what I did for this talk, I just read through a lot of, there are hundreds of emails, so I read through them, and from September 2018, when the book was published, through to November 2025, when James died. And some interesting threads emerged, which I think reflect James's thoughts and emotions following the release of the book, and following the reviews which ensued, the majority of which, of course, by the way, were very positive. So, like three themes emerged. James's reaction to the modernist reviews of his book, James's reaction to the main criticism by modernists of Making Dystopia, and some of the changes to architecture that James hoped that Making Dystopia would, help trigger. So, I think that's slide 4. That's the book, yes. As soon as Making Dystopia was launched, James was waiting for the fallout, from the modernists, of course. He got so many great reviews from the non-modernists, like too many to mention here. and all from very highly respected writers and practitioners. He knew that from some modernist quarters, there would be no response at all. In other words, that the book would be deliberately ignored. Others he knew would attack the book, regardless of any good points raised in it, because it challenged the establishment viewpoint. James, I knew him, I think, pretty well then, expected any criticism to be objective, and I know that he was always ready to listen. He would gladly have acknowledged any mistakes that he may have made in making dystopia, and in the pursuit of truth, would actually, I think, have been excited to uptake and refine his work, with any more or new accurate material. That was what he was like, and we've heard that from Bob this morning. When they did come, the modernist reviews were from very well-known critics in the field, such as Stephen Bailey from The Spectator, Hugh Pearman, the RIBA Journal, that's the Royal Institute of British Architects, if you don't know that, and William White, the Literary Review. And true to form, the sort of criticism we got was more of the tired, old, dismissive remarks we'd all heard 100 times before. When I said to James at the time, because he was a bit down, "Yes, James, your book is being hated, as expected, by the modernist camp, but what is reassuring is that your book is being hated by all the right people." So, slide 5. Look, I'm not going to all the detail on each review, but Stephen Bailey's reaction was typical when he said that he, to quote, "threw the book away." So, this talks about emails, and let's quote some of James's emails. On the 4th of September 2021, he wrote, "Bailey's vicious hatchet job on making dystopia was rather like a damp fart. As he raged about me and my work, threw my poor little book across the room in a tantrum, and then contradicted himself by saying, quote, 'There is only a sliver of difference between Gropius's lofty Bauhaus ideals and a crap housing estate,' unquote. In fact, that sums up what I said, though I did so with rather more elegance and scholarship." Hugh Pearman's piece in the RIBA Journal tried to sum up the book with, and you can see that there, a sort of sneering slogan, I think you might call it, "If it's not trad, he ain't glad." In his piece, there was no recognition of the suffering of the people who were housed in all those disastrous, brutalist local authority blocks of flats, many of which are now thankfully demolished, and no lessons to be learned from the post-war ugliness inflicted upon our towns and cities, and in particular the general public's dislike of the modernist style. No acceptance at all of the aesthetic problems that James had pointed out in his book, including that, and importantly, that modernism generates structurally illogical facades in terms of gravity and readability. No, just a, blanket dismissiveness. On the 27th of September 2018, James wrote in one of his emails, "Thank you," to us in the group, of course, "but I need people to object in the strongest terms to the attempted rubbishing of my work, now in the RIBA Journal. It says my book is not edited. Not true. It was, and carefully read by 8 distinguished academics and checked line by me. I am 81, therefore they assume that I am in my dotage. They had to mention that. They say that I can't draw, and they talk about what I like and what I do not like. It has nothing to do with liking or not. My book is an exposure of a fraud." In an email of the 26th of September 2018, even though he had predicted what would happen with respect to the modernists' criticisms, James expressed his despair about the whole thing. Quote, "The enemy has shown that all it can give us is more dysfunctional dystopian ghastliness, and it gets worse. The latest insults hurled at me are totally predictable. Frankly, I no longer care. Thank you for your support. Much needed for morale." Frankly, I no longer care. When I read that, it did strike me. He was going through a bit of a period, naturally. As you can read from the tone, he was feeling very disappointed with the quality of criticism by the modernists. The William White Review came out on the 9th of November 2018. James wrote that day, "A very unpleasant review by William White has just appeared in the Literary Review, in which the old tricks of trying to associate my arguments with approvals of Nazism and communism are employed. And the first two paragraphs are incomprehensible gibberish. The whole thing is a farrago of nonsense and misrepresentation, sneering, unpleasant, and deeply offensive because he attributes to me many things I never said and in which I do not believe." But it was the RIBA Journal's reaction to the book that disturbed James the most. Not because of the actual Pearman review per se, because the chap is entitled, of course, to his own opinion, but because James, he had been a member of the RIBA since the 1960s. And he expected some balance in the Institute's coverage. Pearman did the review, but he was also the editor. So why did Pearman not choose to procure, let's say, 2 reviews, knowing that there's a split in the architectural profession in terms of style, one from each side of the divide? So James wrote to the RIBA to complain about its utter lack of, I'm saying diversity of opinion because at that stage DEI was the big thing in the RIBA. Yes. I mean, I also wrote to the RIBA to help James in that sense. And after a month of corresponding with the then CEO, he loved that title, the chap who was the head of the RIBA called himself a CEO, neither of us got a satisfactory response. Then on the 3rd of November 2018, almost be a whole month later, without an adequate reply from the RIBA, James wrote in an email, "I am not going to let the CEO off the hook as his behaviour is completely out of order. But I have couched the whole thing in very moderate terms, even though I was tempted to challenge the perpetrator to a duel on Salisbury Plain with field guns." Because of the RIBA's failure to deal with the unfairness of James's treatment in the September 2018 edition of the journal, I personally made the decision to no longer be a member. I was so annoyed with the whole situation. But James stayed on, only because he needed to keep availing of the RIBA library drawings and archives collection for his ongoing excellent, thoughtful research. On the 2nd of November 2022, James referred to, quote, "the ad hominem vulgar abuse I have had to put up with from the uglifiers and cult members of Corbusianity, notably in the sneering, rancid pages of that rag which purports to be the organ of a so-called professional institute, the ghastly RIBA journal, not worth the paper on which it is printed." A difficult time for James. I could see that from the emails, even though he had prepared for it, So, isn't it true of life that when you think that your mind is ready to cope with an inevitable onslaught, the stark reality of that onslaught, when it happens, may not be exactly what you had imagined? I think at that time James was feeling this. I guess that all of this reflects what any great thinker like James must experience at times like this. A sensitive and talented author will seek to uncover great truths, as we all know, then naturally feel propelled to share and disseminate those truths in order to help others, only for that sensitive and talented author to be overcome with anxiety at the resistance encountered from a rather large hostile group. And I believe that this was the sort of pain that James was going through shortly after the publication of Making Dystopia. And, long after too. On the 12th of November 2024, James wrote in an email, "There are times I long for death. Those times are becoming more frequent." Colin Mulhern replied, "You can always turn to drink, James." To which James said, "Oh, don't you worry, I do." Okay, so let's look at the second thread that is apparent from James's reading over the emails. I've gone too far with that one. From 2018 to 2025. So basically, this thread, a brief thread, is about James's reaction to the main criticism by modernists of making dystopia. And I'll cut to the quick here and summarize what the modernist critics actually believed was the main shortcoming of the book. It was, they said, that James's book came too late in the day, a century after the birth of modern architecture, to shape the style, or at least to temper the ideology behind the style, or something like that. They also claimed that modern architecture has moved on. It has progressed, they said, from the early experimental days of Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius to having become an accepted and valued style, they said, in itself. For example, Stephen Bailey said in his review, so his review was, again, to remind myself, yes, The Spectator, like one of those innocents, he said about James Big, like one of those innocents who reenact the Civil War in embarrassing costume on bank holidays, Curl has been time-traveling backwards into a pre-modern world. He returns from the past with a crude message, etc., etc. William White's review of Making Dystopia in the Literary Review states, this book offers a curious resurrection of arguments first made almost a century ago and is primarily directed against a group of architects and writers, almost all of whom died a generation ago. Architecture has moved on, and architectural history has certainly moved on. In his email chat with us, James's reaction was that these reviewers mustn't have properly read his book. Firstly, he believed that it's never too late to uncover and to speak the truth. Also, unfortunately, sometimes things have to get really bad, and for people to see that and to say enough is enough. And this is where we're now at, Curl believed. After over 100 years of modernism, our built environments have become very ugly. I mean, far too ugly, I think. James wrote, if you remember, in Making Dystopia, that the world is full of, quote, ephemeral architecture that is here today and sadly not gone tomorrow. We're way past the tipping point where, in so many places, ugly buildings now are well in the majority. As for today's modernism having moved on from that of 100 years ago, James's reaction was no. Today's version of modernism is fundamentally the same, based on the same early principles that were laid down by what he called in an email dated the 15th of February 2023, the so-called heroes of modernism. James wrote, all these heroes of modernism, the ones alleged to be scientific, progressive, rational, etc., were just members of an unpleasant, irrational, fundamentalist, mad, quasi-religious cult, which still rules the roost, he underlined. It is clear, as Professor Curl pointed out and indeed demonstrated in his book, that the original modernist ideas still form the foundation of design in most of our schools of architecture and in the design of nearly all of our new buildings. So let's be specific here. What did he mean? Let's be specific, because the modernists would love me to talk in general terms. This modernist ideology that James was talking about demands that new buildings should always look novel, no matter what, and contrast strongly with their context. They should ideally shock the viewer, have facades which appear structurally illogical, avoiding the expression of vertical load paths in accordance with the natural laws of gravity. Don't worry, modernists, because your look no hands creation will be held up by a structural engineer. Use lots of exposed concrete, and you should insist that this is a structurally honest material whilst drawing attention away, followers, from the hidden steel reinforcement, which is key to it standing up. That new buildings should always aim to be three-dimensional sculptures in the round, even if they're anti-urban. 5, include, where possible, lots of white rendered surfaces for some reason, flat roofs, horizontal strip windows, pilotis, and big cantilevers, again for some reason, except that is if one has opted to do blobby texture, in which case anything goes. And 6, be devoid of decoration, which is strictly haram. Every new modernist building Design today, James explained, is shot through with these uglifying ideas, like Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. James showed in his book that each one of the various phases of modernism we've all experienced over the years, including the latest one, whatever that is, was just another repackaged version of the original thing. James was, in fact, entertained by the modernist reviewers' attempts. He was disturbed by them, but he was also entertained by their attempts to try and put us off scrutinizing their so-called heroes from the earliest 20th century. It is the only argument, and I know from his emails he believed it is the only argument they have left. And because practically all of the negative reviews majored on this point, he saw that they had exposed their Achilles heel. This showed James that he had attacked modernism where it is most vulnerable. And if there are any lessons to take away, it is that we should do exactly the opposite of what Bailey, Pearman, and White criticized James for, and continue to see through the myriad of sub-modernist spin-off styles for what they are, namely all children of the early 20th century international style. If James were to send us an email right now, wherever he is, it would very likely read as follows. Of course, I've made this one up because he's not with us. He would say, "Dear friends, gathered here in my beloved Oslo, let me step in and just say to you that in order to deal successfully with the spread of a bad religion, because that is exactly what modernism is, I urge you to please keep returning again and again to its roots, to the original doctrine expounded by its prophet, or in this case, prophets, and keep challenging its articles of faith. Keep ridiculing its irrational strictures. Modernism today is the same as it ever was." So, let's look finally at the third strand, which is a few of the changes that James hoped, looking towards the future, that Making Dystopia would make to the world of architecture. And I think we all know by now what James generally wanted to achieve in writing the book Making Dystopia was to set the record straight, of course, on the correct history of modern architecture, to encourage the rediscovery of beauty in architecture, and as a practical start, to radically change the way schools of architecture treat the subject and teach the subject. So I'll finish on two emails in particular that James penned, one in 2018 and the other in 2022, which the last one, 2022, contains actually a quite specific recommendation. So the first one sums up James's main ray of hope for the future, namely that, and we've heard great stuff today from young people, that young people are inspired by the book, he hoped, to come forward, question the received wisdom of the old modernist establishment, and are then motivated to design beautiful buildings and places. So on the 20th of November 2018, this email I found stated from James, "I am hugely encouraged by the reaction of more and more young people who are beginning to see that the recipes for dystopia dished out by their bucranial prehistoric dinosaurs of elders are problematic, and more of that will no longer wash. I recall youngsters coming to me to be tutored because they were being bullied by so-called tutors into producing yet more sub-Corbusian stuff to get some support from me, and I had to start from scratch to open their eyes to the riches of what real architecture, based on the principles of gravity, stability, ease, human scale, integration with nature, stable geometries that induced pleasure instead of unease, and all the rest of it, which the cretins had deliberately rejected in favor of their pigeon grunts, which ain't a language at all by any stretch. The Reformation," he said, "is overdue. Let's get on with it and stop these fools wrecking what's left of civilization." The other email that I want to highlight was written by James, the last one, on the 29th of November 2022, 3 years after I met him. It is actually quite specific, that's why I picked it, and appears to advise that we should no longer rely on the existing professional architecture institutes that are still totally captured by modernism, and to start thinking about setting up new professional institutes of our own to replace them. Referring to his own institute, he wrote, "There is no hope while the indoctrination of architectural students into the dystopian nonsense of modernism continues. My view is that until there is a drastic reformation, underlined in bold, within the architectural profession, and it is converted, underlined and in bold, from the fundamentalist, inhumane cult of ugliness, the deification of horrible fascists like Le Corbusier, and the blind worship of so-called starchy texts, to all of which it presently adheres, nothing will change. And if it cannot be changed from within, then a new organization has to be established in opposition to the architectural establishment based on human values, recognition that ugliness is harmful to humans, and the word beauty is once more restored to a place of honor in environmental matters," he wrote. So here we have it. He said it is likely that nothing will change, which I agree with him on. And secondly, that a new organization has to be established. So I believe that here James was predicting the need to create a new professional institute of architecture, not just in the UK, but in every country, to set standards in ethics, award chartered status, control the definition of what is good design, and directly address house builders and developers so that we, as traditional architects, can have a better share of the important big design jobs. So in terms of the future, I'd like to end on that. On James's behalf, I'll finish by placing this very concrete idea of James's out there for you all to think about. Thank you.